Zevin Faust has done it again. Did he break standard? Hi everybody, I'm Ryan, and today we're going to talk about the Golgari Graveyard deck that was played at Pro Tour Aetherdrift by Zevin Faust. That is a really cool and unique take on Golgari and an Up the Beanstalk deck and all that stuff. Today we're going to talk about the deck, the overall strategy of the deck, and how to play the deck. Let's jump into it. So this is the Golgari Graveyard deck by Zevin Faust. Look great on camera, like at any point. But essentially what you're attempting to do is put as many creatures in the graveyard as possible, and then you're playing a ton of payoffs that reward you for putting all of those creatures into the graveyard. That's the long and short of it. As far as the lands go, there's nothing special going on. You're playing the Golgari lands and whatnot. We're playing 4 Molt Tender. Molt Tender is a 1-mana 1/1. We can tap it to mill a card, which is great. We want to be filling our graveyard. And we can also tap it to exile a card from your graveyard to add 1 mana of any color. So while it's requires us to have cards in our graveyard in order for it to be a mana dork, it's very easy for this deck to do. So it's a mana dork that also puts additional cards into our graveyard. C-Note Scout is a 1-mana 1/1. However, when it enters, it explores, where you reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land, you put it into your hand. If it's a non-land, you put a +1/+1 counter on C-Note Scout, and you may put it in your graveyard. Great for filling up our graveyard or even digging and drawing. We're playing for 9 Vermin. When it enters, target player mills 2 cards, so it allows us to continue to fill our graveyard. And when it dies, target creature you don't control gets -1/-1 till end of turn. Very good against the aggressive decks and just is a decent blocker. This brings us to a bunch of our payoffs. So we're going to start with Souls of the Lost. Souls of the Lost is a 2-mana star +1. As additional cost to cast a spell, discard a card or sacrifice a permanent, which is fine. We want to be filling our graveyard anyway, and frankly, there's a lot of cards in our deck that just don't do anything when you're not in a certain situations. And Souls of the Lost power is equal to the number of permanent cards in your graveyard, and its toughness is equal to that number +1. Nearly every card in our deck is a permanent card, and literally every card in our deck in the main deck is a permanent card, besides Overwhelming Remorse. So Souls of the Lost gets very, 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 very big, very, 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 very quickly. It's a great blocker and can finish out games very quickly. We're also playing 2 Up the Beanstalk. Up the Beanstalk, 2-mana enchantment. When it enters, and whenever you cast a spell, mana value 5 or greater, draw a card. This can give you massive mana advantage and just be an engine in your deck, because even though all of these cards, besides Harvester of Misery, can be cast for less than 5 mana, they're all considered 5 mana. So whether we are playing Overlord of the Baelmurk for its impending, Overwhelming Remorse for 1 mana, Chitin Gravestalker for 1 mana, Hollow Marauder for 1 mana, Husband's Sword for 1 mana. All of them trigger Up the Beanstalk, and so it can really allow us to leverage our deck in a way that we can pull way, 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 way ahead. Speaking of all of these cards as well, really the only card that doesn't fall into this category, like I said, is Harvester of Misery. It's a 5-mana 5/4 with Menace. When Harvester of Misery enters, other creatures get -2/-2 till end of turn. Very good against the aggressive and the go-wide decks. However, we can discard it and pay 2 mana to have target creature get -2/-2 till end of turn. This is a way to put a permanent into the graveyard and by and large a creature into the graveyard while still having a removal spell, which is pretty sweet. And Overlord of the Baelmurk is sort of in between being a payoff and not. It's a 5-mana 5/5. Whenever it enters or attacks, mill 4 cards, and then you may return a non-avatar creature card or a planeswalker card from your graveyard to your hand. So it can't like return itself. And it has impending 5 for 2 mana. So you can just cast it for 2 mana, trigger that Up the Beanstalk, be able to fill your graveyard, and then select one of these payoffs to be able to put into your hand. We're also playing Overwhelming Remorse. It's a 5-mana instant to exile target creature or planeswalker. Exile removal is so good in standard at the moment. And this spell costs 1 last for each creature card in your graveyard. We are filling our graveyard anyway, so very often this is 1 mana. We're playing 2 Chitin Gravestalker. 1 last to cast for each artifact and or creature card in your graveyard. Has cycling 2, so if we need to dig, we can just like put that creature in our graveyard and it discounts everything else. But as long as we have 5 creatures in our graveyard, which is very easy to do, this is a 1-mana 5/4. Hollow Marauder has that same text, however it has flying, and when it enters, any number of target opponents each discard a card. For each of those opponents who didn't discard a card with mana value 4 or greater, draw a card. And it's 4/2. For effectively 1 mana very often. This essentially says against everything but Domain, you get to draw a card and your opponent discards a card, because there's not a lot of cards that are being played that are mana value 4 or greater. And specifically against Domain, it is very, very powerful because you want to be tearing apart their hand, though be afraid of Obstinate Baloth. And they're playing Houseburster's Swarm, as long as we have 7 or more creature cards in our graveyard. This is a 1 mana 6/6 menace Death Touch. By the way, this also cares about being in exile as well, which is pretty solid. So we're trying to fill our graveyard with as many permanents and creatures as possible, and then play these payoffs and all these undercosted things and trigger out the Beanstalk a whole bunch of times. It is such a cool take on the graveyard deck. Or as far as the sideboard goes, we have some instances of sorceries. Got to be careful about siding those in because they do not work with our game plan. But we're playing Cut Down for these aggressive decks, Duress for things like Domain or Control or whatever. Starving Revenant is a 4 mana 4/4. When it enters, Surveil 2, then for each card you put on top of your library, you draw a card and lose 3 life. We have Descend 8. Whenever you draw a card, if there are 8 or more permanent cards in your graveyard, target opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. This is very good against decks that are going to go really, really long, allows you to dig. And we can get that Descend super, super, super easy. We're playing Terror Tide, 4 mana sorcery. All creatures get -X/-X till end of turn, where X the number of permanent cards in your graveyard. Really good against the go wide decks, or really just, I mean, this just like kills everything on the battlefield very easily because we have permanent cards in our graveyard all the time. Playing an extra Harvester of Misery in our sideboard for these aggressive decks. We're playing 4 Scrap Shooter. It's a 3 mana 4/4 with reach. And when it enters, if a gift was promised, destroy target artifact or enchantment opponent controls. Great Artifact Enchantment Hate. Also a 3 mana 4/4 is a decent blocker as well. Obstinate Baloth is a 4 mana 4/4. When it enters, you gain 4 life, and then if your opponent makes you discard it, you get to put it on the battlefield instead of your graveyard. Very, very good against the Pixie decks because of Hopeless Nightmare. Also decent against the aggressive decks, so you gain life and it's a blocker. And we're playing Haywire Might. It's a 1 mana 1/1. When it dies, you gain 2 life, and you can pay a green and sacrifice Haywire Might to exile target non-creature artifact or non-creature enchantment. Again, great artifact and enchantment hate. We need this, by the way, the Scrap Shooter and Haywire Might for things like Rest in Peace and stuff like that, because that's real bad for us. And it gains life, which is pretty relevant. But this is Zevin Faust's graveyard deck that he top 8'd Pro Tour Aetherdrift with. It's so impressive. It's such a sweet deck. We'll see if it's good. We'll see if the meta adjusts. But it is certainly very sweet. If you like this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. Check me out on social medias. Links are above me and in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.